And so, welcome everybody. We are gonna start with a talk, a coordinated talk by Sownak, Bose, Andrew Hearin, and Peter Behroozi on the advances in modeling the galaxy-halo connection. So I mute myself, stop my video, and Sownak, please take it over.
So considering this is a reunion talk and that I wasn't at the original 2017 meeting, I feel like I'm crashing a party or something at the moment. But so what we are doing in this first session is talking about some of the recent advances in modeling the galaxy-halo connection. And how we thought we'd split that task between us is as follows. So I'll begin by talking about some of the recent developments in the physical models for building the galaxy-halo connection, and then there'll be an extended discussion of how we can use observations to constrain this better. And then to conclude, there'll be a discussion of how perhaps this field might progress in the future, and hopefully this will lead to some of the items for discussion later on as well. But I thought I would start with this completely unscientific diagram, which lists some of the various rungs of the galaxy-halo connection as we've come to appreciate it in this plane of model complexity and motivation. So sort of part midway through this diagram, you can split things between empirical models and the so-called physical models, which I'll mostly focus on today. And each of these models have their own advantages and disadvantages, and they sort of come into their own under different circumstances. So, for example, the regime of the empirical models are perhaps more in the case of using very large data sets where you're trying to mock up a survey with gigaparsec size simulations where hydrosyms are complex. We have the forward models and SAMs, which are especially helpful for exploratory purposes in trying to understand how different parameters or different ways of modeling the galaxy-halo connection can change the measurements that we get out at the end. And at the end, we have of course, hydrodynamical simulations where, quote unquote, which have the physics done in the most realistic manner. And these are especially useful for validation purposes for the other rungs of the galaxy-halo connection models. Now, in recent times, there have been quite a lot of significant advances when it comes to modeling hydrodynamical simulations. And there's a great review by Mark Vogelsberger recently, which essentially describes some of the recent advances. And amongst the chief improvements that have been made of late are the fact that now these simulations are reaching much greater volumes in a scale that is now relevant to the goals of large-scale structure cosmology. And the most massive halos that can be found in these volumes are now being treated in a sort of better way in terms of how black holes grow and evolve within them and the associated feedback as a result of these active galactic nuclei. And this has profound effects both for the growth of galaxies within these halos, but also for the surrounding large-scale structure, which we'll see in a moment. But more interestingly, perhaps, is that many of the physics models that were perhaps once considered a little too frivolous or maybe too exotic, such as the inclusion of magnetic fields or thermal conduction or cosmic rays, are now increasingly becoming part of the mainstream. And this sort of development of more physical models is especially manifest in the regime of dwarf galaxies, so the other end of the scale, where the increased resolution capacities of these simulations allow us to actually model the multiphase interstellar medium and the changes in the star formation properties of dwarf galaxies as a result. So I won't talk about dwarf galaxies much at all because I believe there's dedicated talks for that. But to understand how feedback really is affecting the galaxy-halo connection, there's this a nice diagram that is in Annalisa Pillepich's paper introducing the illustrious TNG simulations, which shows the stellar to halo mass ratio on the y-axis and the halo mass on the x-axis, with the gray contours essentially showing observational constraints on this relationship. And the different colored lines show model variations of the TNG physics. And what's immediately noticeable is that the inclusion or not, as the case may be, of various processes has quite dramatic effects on what the stellar mass content of halos is. So in particular, for the most massive halos, as we now have come to appreciate universally, black holes play a pretty critical role in terms of how massive these galaxies actually end up being. And there are also variations in exactly how this feedback is implemented, whether it's just in a thermal mode or a kinetic mode. And of course, on smaller scales, maybe scales relevant to the Milky Way and galaxies smaller than that, it's the impact of galactic winds that play a very critical role in terms of how massive these things get. But black holes are interesting not only because they regulate how massive galaxies get in the most massive halos, but they also the sort of resulting feedback from the AGN in massive galaxies also affects the large-scale clustering of matter. So this is a compilation of results from hydrodynamical simulations by Cesari et al., which shows the ratio of the power spectrum in a simulation with dark matter and baryons divided by the power spectrum in a dark matter only simulation as a function of scale. And what the main point to sort of take away is that whereas on the most, maybe the largest scales, there's not that much of a difference, as one starts proceeding to go towards smaller scales, there is this pretty consistent effect of the total clustering of matter in the hydrodynamic simulation being suppressed relative to the dark matter only simulation. This is essentially because AGN sort of blow gas out from the middle, so groups and clusters, and push them out to the outskirts of these halos. And the resulting change in the clustering is what is measured as this suppression overall. As you go to even smaller scales, these curves then shoot upwards because you then get into the regime where star formation and cooling are actually enhancing the clustering. But what's interesting here is that while perhaps most simulations nowadays agree on the sign of the effect, there is still a fair amount of stochasticity in terms of quite what the magnitude of this effect is. And if the total matter distribution is used to constrain cosmological parameters, this is something we might want to pin down further. And a nice example of sort of trying to model this effect was shown in this recent work by Van Dalen et al., where now again the y-axis shows the response and the total clustering of matter in the hydrodynamic simulation relative to a dark matter only case at a particular scale, which is at k equals 0.5 in this case. And the x-axis is now showing the baryon content of cluster mass halos, so the amount of baryons within R500. And you notice that there's a pretty well-defined relationship here where simulations where most of the baryons retained are the ones where the matter power spectrum is the least perturbed, and vice versa. And of course, this goes back to this idea of AGN blowing gas out of halos. And the dashed curve here is a model that has been built which actually correlates the influence of the relationship, I suppose, between the baryon content of these massive objects and what the influence is on the total clustering of matter. And so therefore, it would seem as though actually getting this baryon content correct in terms of what the observational data seems to point at would be important if you want to understand these effects better. Now, in terms of semitic models, of course, their great power relative to hydrodynamical simulations is that they can be applied to much larger volumes. So there have been recent applications of SAMs to things like the Millennium XXL simulation, which have gigaparsec scale volumes. And you can then get statistically sound measurements of things like H1 mass functions and so on and so forth. But one of the, I think, interesting aspects of SAMs of late is that the calibration of model parameters is being now applied to a much more diverse set of data. So it's now no longer sort of sufficient just to reproduce luminosity functions or stellar mass functions of galaxies, but also things like the large-scale clustering. And depending on what data sets are used, you actually end up with very different sets of constraints on the galaxy formation parameters of your model in a way that I'll show you in a second. On smaller scales, there's been quite a lot of interest of late in this so-called orphan technique, which I'm sure will come up later on over the course of the next couple of days. And this is essentially this idea of modeling satellite galaxies where, as a halo ends up turning into a subhalo after falling into a bigger host, there will come a point where it is no longer possible to actually continue tracking the evolution of this object because it gets disrupted below the resolution limit of the simulation, either because of numerical reasons or for physical reasons. And these orphan techniques essentially help keep tabs on these galaxies that may exist until the final day, but no longer have a resolved halo associated with them. And this has very dramatic effects on the one halo clustering end of the scale, as well as on the galaxy halo connection for dwarfs. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's more diverse data sets being used to constrain model parameters, and this is a nice example from the L galaxies model developed in Munich. So each of these panels shows the projected two-point clustering of galaxies with data from Sloan shown with the white symbols. And there are three different line styles of a particular color, and the different colors refer to which data set the model is calibrated to, and the three line styles are essentially three permutations of model parameters that give equally good fits to that particular data set. Okay, so it's just a sort of high likelihood parameters. And so the models in yellow show models where the L galaxies model has been calibrated to reproduce the stellar mass function only. And what we notice is that reproducing just the stellar mass function does not guarantee that the two-point clustering is also reproduced. On the other hand, the blue curves all gave equally good fits to the two-point correlation function, at least relative to one another, but they don't all necessarily reproduce the stellar mass function of galaxies at redshift 0. So simultaneously fitting these diverse sets of data can be quite powerful in terms of constraining our model parameters better. Now, I mentioned orphan galaxies briefly, and this is I think a situation that is still not very well understood, and this is where the robustness of semianalytic models are perhaps throwing up more questions than providing answers for. So this is shown quite nicely in this comparison project of semianalytic models by Puyol et al., which shows the fraction of galaxies of a particular stellar mass that are identified as orphans, which, as I said, are these entities that no longer have a resolved dark matter halo to them. And each of these different colored lines show the orphan fractions in different semianalytic models. And there's basically two takeaways here. Firstly, especially as you go to lower stellar mass objects, these orphan fractions don't seem to be very small. So typically between 10 and 30% of the satellite content of galaxies may be in the form of these orphans. But the other important thing to note is that there's also quite a lot of variation from one semianalytic model to another as to quite how significant orphans tend to be in the overall census of things. They're all run on the same dark matter only simulation, but calibrated in slightly different ways, so that causes part of the difference. But also the treatment of objects once they become orphans is very different as well, and that's what leads to these sorts of effects. So if you then try and fold this through to a measurement of clustering, we can see what actually happens. So the left-hand panel shows the 3D clustering of galaxies more massive than about 10 to the 9 or so. And different models are shown in the different lines. And while there is model-to-model variation, the variation, especially if you compare the dashed lines, is not especially large, at least when compared to what happens on the right-hand side, which shows the clustering of galaxies when we start including these orphan populations, where there's quite a big discrepancy now between what different models are actually predicting, especially in the one halo term. And there's not only model variations, but the overall amplitude of the clustering is also increased relative to what happens if we just include the result satellites, which is what was shown on the left. So physical, oh yeah.
Can I interrupt? Under the assumptions that you guys are sharing the time, this is your call for 1 or 2 minutes to wrap up your part.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Physical models. So Annalisa, can you tell me how many minutes I've spoken for?
I think it was like 11 or 12.
Yeah, so I think I'll be speaking for about 15 minutes, and Peter and will be sorry, I should have probably said that in the beginning.
No problem.
Yeah, so physical models like semianalytics and hydrodynamical simulations are useful because they provide critical validation data. So what I mean by this is that you can ask questions like, how are satellite galaxies distributed within their host halos? So this is a result from Illustrious TNG, which shows the radial distribution of satellite galaxies, where the luminous satellites in the model are shown with the black stars. And the dark gray curve that you see here with my pointer shows the radial distribution of the subhalos in the dark matter only counterpart of these halos, where you see that the subhalo distribution is much shallower compared to the luminous satellites themselves. The dashed blue curve, on the other hand, shows the density profile of the host dark matter halo, so it's just an NFW profile. And that seems to give rather a better fit to what the distribution of satellite galaxies, at least the luminous ones, tends to be. You can also ask, for example, if we were to construct a more exotic galaxy sample that we want to create a mock for, such as, say, we want to create a mock catalog of emission line galaxies for DESI, then semianalytic models can actually help you at least figure out what perhaps the shape of the HODs of these galaxies might look like, that you can then transplant onto bigger volume simulations to get a sort of light cone catalog of emission line galaxies. So this is work done by Gonzalez Perez et al., who used the Durham semianalytic model GALFORM to identify O2 emitting galaxies under various choices of the color and magnitude cuts that would be applied in eBOS or in DESI, and the resulting HODs are shown in these curves, which look rather quite different and non-trivial to model if one were to just use the simple sort of 5-parameter models that are on the market. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, these physical models are useful because they help provide critical validation data for how robust and how accurate empirical models are. So there's been a lot of work of late in trying to see how well things like HODs and shams, these abundance matching models, actually work in terms of predicting the clustering of galaxies compared to what's shown in hydrodynamical simulations. And really the consistent picture that we are finding, and many others are finding, is that at least the simplest manifestations of these models don't seem to predict the clustering of galaxies as just one particular metric very well. And that requires us to think more about augmenting these models, or perhaps even abandoning some of the simplest versions of these models completely. And to end with, I just want to talk about some of the uses of these physical models of late in modeling and quantifying systematic effects. And the development of these sort of approximate methods, which try and emulate the effect of baryons by calibrating against hydrodynamical simulations, is going to become, I think, more and more widespread, because we'll eventually reach a limit where hydrodynamical simulations become impossible to do on very large boxes. So one example is the so-called baryonification approach, where one basically perturbs the distribution of particles in the vicinity of halos by applying some kind of displacement function, where the displacement function depends on the gas and dark matter density profiles of halos, calibrated against observations or hydrodynamical simulations. So an example of this process is shown on the right-hand side, where, again, this shows the power spectrum response, as showed before. The colored bands show the predictions of the simulations themselves, and the lines are predictions of this baryonification model, where the parameters are calibrated so as to basically reproduce the gas profiles measured in these simulations. And the benefit is you can then do parameter forecasts to see how biased you would actually be in trying to estimate cosmological parameters from observations, depending on whether or not baryons are actually included in your analysis. So this diagram here shows in the sort of smaller white contours the parameters that would be inferred if baryonic effects were ignored in a Euclid-like survey, where the input baryonic cosmological parameters are shown in the crosshairs, whereas actually marginalizing over the baryonic effects shows these contours in blue, which have wider errors to them perhaps, but at least get closer towards the target cosmology. And there's also been work recently in trying to quantify other types of systematics, especially in weak lensing, such as in the case of the so-called intrinsic alignments of galaxies, where we found that spheroidal galaxies tend to be oriented and elongated, or rather disk galaxies tend to be clustered in a way that are oriented and elongated in the direction of nearby spheroidals. And these are the kinds of things that we can begin to model and at least fold into our future analyses. So I'm going to end by just showing this slide of some of the outstanding issues that we have, which may be worth discussing. So from the modeling side of things, there are questions with regards to how we improve our physical models of black hole seeding and growth. Do we just end up forgetting about all of this and just marginalizing all overall possible galaxy formation parameters in the first place? And then there are perhaps more philosophical questions with regards to how well converged any of these inferences we've made so far are orphans being treated correctly, are substructures actually evolving in the right way, and are there perhaps vagaries in the boundary definitions of halos, and how could that actually affect our calculations later on? So I'll stop here and I will shift to Peter if he is ready to take on the baton.
Hi, everyone. Great. So Andrew and I are splitting the observational side. And so if this seems like a grab bag of different things, that's because since 2017, people have gone in so many different directions. So I'll talk a bit about splashback radii, which you'll hear, I'm assuming, more about later this morning. Just to remind you, splashback radii, what those are, if you have a halo, a satellite is coming in, goes through on its first infall, comes out the other side, and then from gravitational attraction from that halo, slows down, turns around, and falls back in. So that transition between the first orbit and the second infall occurs roughly at where the splashback radius is. In 2017, we just had some results from Zuhrid Moore looking at red matter clusters, finding the interesting result that the splashback radius seemed to be offset from dark matter simulations. And then in the time since then, there have been many, many more observations that now we understand better that optical cluster finders can give you a bias on where the splashback radii are. And if you look at, say, SC selected clusters or X-ray selected clusters, then where the splashback radius is ends up aligning pretty closely with dark matter simulations. Next slide. So another interesting thing about splashback radii is that they correlate, the location of splashback radius correlates with dark matter accretion rate. So I just want to walk you through that. So if you have a host halo of satellites falling in, that satellite will acquire some velocity as it comes in. And on the way out, if that host halo does not grow, that's the middle panel, then the potential well depth is the same on the way out as it is on the way in. And so that satellite goes out to roughly the same distance that it fell in from. On the other hand, if the host halo is growing, then the potential well is deeper on the way out than it was on the way in. And so that satellite doesn't get out as far before it turns back around. And so you have a tighter set of satellite orbits, you have a smaller splashback radius. Okay, so that's interesting. The reason why it's interesting is then the splashback radius, its location, correlates with dark matter accretion rate. And it's not just the splashback radius, it's all the orbits of satellites. So if you go to the next slide. In simulations, if you split dark matter halos by those that are rapidly accreting versus not so rapidly accreting, you find that satellite orbits are much tighter around the higher accreting ones. And this effect is so strong that it persists even in projection. So in other words, if you look in projected distance at the number of neighbors around highly accreting halos, that's the blue line with stars, versus less highly accreting halos, that's the red line with dots. You find that the profiles of neighbors are much tighter or squeezed around those halos that are more rapidly accreting. And so that's interesting because that's an observational thing that you can measure. You can measure the number density of neighbors around, say, Milky Way mass galaxies. And you can ask, does dark matter accretion rate correlate at all with the star formation rate of those galaxies? Now you have to be a little bit careful that there's nothing larger nearby, like a cluster, that can mess with these number density distributions. But if you look at isolated galaxies only, that's the next slide. Or rather, my student, Christine O'Donnell, looked at this, and she found something super interesting, which was for Milky Way mass galaxies and above at redshift 0, the star-forming galaxies had, if anything, slightly shallower satellite profiles than the quiescent galaxies. And so at face value, what that would mean is that Milky Way mass galaxies don't seem to care about the accretion rate, dark matter accretion rate, and presumably the fresh gas accretion rate in terms of whether they're star forming or not. Another interpretation could be just that star forming Milky Way mass galaxies are able to eat their satellites better. So this is something that will be explored further with lensing, where you don't have to worry as much about satellites getting eaten. Okay, next slide. Another thing that we heard about at the 2017 meeting was from Alison Coyle, who was looking in Primus at the clustering of galaxies in different places along the star-forming main sequence, off the star-forming main sequence. The student Angela Berti has been doing some great work looking in Sloan, seeing if this effect continues down to redshift 0. It does. So the summary of this, if you look at, say, the second column, is if you split galaxies in the main sequence, those that are more highly star-forming versus slightly less star-forming have different clustering. Or if you go to the third column or the fourth column, if you split and dice in different ways, no matter how you split, you always find that there's a difference in clustering within the main sequence at fixed stellar mass or parallel to the main sequence, so on. And what this says is, I think, at least two things. One is that in Sloan, there is actually real information as opposed to just noise in terms of star formation rates within the main sequence. And second, whatever is causing galaxies to go up or down in the main sequence has some correlation with environment. Okay, so then next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about understanding halo properties beyond halo mass and halo accretion rate. So we talked a bit about halo accretion rate from splashback radii, but what about other halo properties? How can we understand how other halo properties like concentration, spin, mergers, and so on correlate with the environment and galaxy properties? So if you had asked me about a week ago, I would have said it's basically impossible to say how something like halo spin might influence galaxy properties in a measurable way. This week, after I made this plot, then I would say the opposite thing. So I think all of you are familiar with assembly bias, or as probably the better term is secondary bias, where halo clustering depends not only on halo mass, but it also depends on other properties of that halo. And it turns out that no matter which other property you pick, there's basically some effect on clustering. And not only is there an effect on clustering that is an overall normalization offset, it's a scale-dependent bias. That is, how much of an offset you get depends on the distance scale over which you're looking. Okay, so what I plotted here is for several different halo properties. That's concentration, that's spin, that's merger history. As a sort of the proxy I'm using there is the kinetic potential energy of the halo, and halo growth rate, which is really I'm using here the half mass scale factor. And each of these different halo properties, if you split halos into those which have higher than median versus lower than median values for that property, and you ask what does their projected correlation function look like, you find that every single different halo property has a different effective clustering signal if you take the ratio of things that are large versus small in that quantity.
Peter?
Yeah.
A question, what is this plot based upon?
Great. So this is based on an abundance match catalog for the Bolshoi-Planck simulation. I've just taken Sloan stellar masses, abundance matched them with 0.2 decks of scatter, and then split galaxies by whether they had high or low halo concentrations, spins, kinetic potential energy ratios, and half mass scale factors.
Thank you.
And I'm plotting them the ratio of the correlation function between things that have large values versus small values. Great. So then this is fun because it means like if there's some galaxy property that we think correlates with halo spin, for example, a big one has been that we think or have thought for a long time that galaxy size might correlate with halo spin. And a few years ago, Andrew Hearin measured in Sloan what is the clustering of large galaxies versus small galaxies. So if you take that ratio, if you go to the next slide, if galaxy sizes were entirely correlated with the halo spins, then you would get the red line for the ratio of clustering between large and small galaxies. You actually go to real observations, you get the blue dots, which looks something totally different. And what you find is a model, for example, like halo concentration. If there's a mild anti-correlation between halo concentration and galaxy size, like in the Zhang et al. 2019 paper, then you get something which is actually a much closer match to the observed clustering. Great. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Andrew.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so further along the lines of progress along the observation side since the previous meeting. So this plot on the left is taken from a recent paper led by Quan Wang from last year. And what she did was she studied a wide range of summary statistics, trying to understand which observable has the tightest constraining power on galaxy assembly bias. And she considered two-point clustering and lensing, and also the void probability function, counts in cells. And the basic takeaway from this result is that you can get much more precise constraints on the true level of assembly bias when using counts in cells based statistics relative to clustering and lensing. And I think this reflects our basic understanding of the sort of meaning of assembly bias, which at a purely statistical level is really just refers to situations in which some subsample of galaxies tends to hog all of the pairs in the clustering. And so the nice thing about counts in cells is that it lets you use higher order information to constrain exactly this effect, but with a point estimator that's just as efficient to compute as the two-point function. And so there's another exciting new development along these lines, recent work led by Arka Banerjee, shown here in the plot on the right. And essentially what Arka and Tom have done in this paper is to develop a systematic framework for formulating higher order information in terms of nearest neighbor statistics. So counts and cell statistics have been just sort of one specific example of this new class of summary statistics. And again, the really nice feature here is that it allows you to mine the data for higher order of information using predictions and measurements that are just as efficient to compute as the two-point function. So the contours shown in this figure, you can see that the nearest neighbor-based statistics contain strong additional constraining power on cosmological parameters beyond the two-point function alone. And so I think these results taken together point to a really promising path forward for just a way of efficiently harvesting information about both cosmology and the galaxy halo connection jointly with higher order statistics. Okay, so next slide. So also along these lines, these plots are taken from a recent paper led by Jeremy Tinker, where he studies how to calibrate a group finding algorithm in a way that gives unbiased estimators of the true underlying HOD of the galaxy sample. And Jeremy's key idea here is to calibrate the free parameters in the group finder until you get an unbiased prediction for the two-point function, as inferred by the from the inferred HOD from the group Kavli analysis. And so, since any group finding algorithm contains higher order information about the density field, and this is a really exciting example, I think, of progress towards squeezing more information that we can get out of the data. And again, actually, the really nice thing about Jeremy's approach here is that it lets you essentially hardwire knowledge about halo occupation statistics into the design of the summary statistic. Okay, so next slide. Great. Okay, so on the n-body simulation side, there's also been enormous progress since the previous KITP meeting, and by now there are many extreme scale simulations that have become publicly available over the last few years. So each of these few examples on the left are survey scale simulations with at least GPC-sized volumes or larger, but now with good enough mass resolution for studies of Milky Way mass halos or below. And so on the right, there are several examples of suites of simulations run over a wide range of cosmological parameters. And I guess the point here is just that the simulations of this quality have now really given us an opportunity over the last few years to really dramatically improve the quality of our synthetic data and also the robustness of the confidence intervals that we can derive on parameters. So if you can go to the next slide, Sownak. So shown in this plot on the left is an image of the Cosmo DC2 mock galaxy catalog. This was generated using the Outer Rim extreme scale simulation run by the hack team at Argonne as part of the Data Challenge 2 of the LSST desk collaboration, the Vera Rubin Observatory. And there are by now many other examples of high quality mock galaxy catalogs generated with extreme scale simulations such as this. I'll list a few here at the bottom of this image. And the plot on the right shows an example on the inference side of a new technique called cosmological evidence modeling, developed by Johannes Lange, in which he forward modeled galaxies into suites of cosmological simulations to derive Bayesian posteriors in cosmology. And so in a nutshell, the way this technique works is that you run your MCMC over your galaxy halo parameters for each individual box in the suite, and then you integrate those posteriors to derive the Bayesian evidence of the cosmological model in a way that accounts for and marginalizes over uncertainty in the galaxy halo connection. So I think this gives a really nice example, sort of highlighting the exciting things that are becoming possible with new theoretical techniques that have the capability to use these high quality simulations that are now becoming widely available. Okay, next slide. Okay, so when making predictions for extreme scale simulations, computational performance becomes a really important issue, especially if you want to constrain the physics of a realistically complex model. So this is one area where I think in coming years, artificial intelligence algorithms are going to play a really important role. And one basic approach to that is sketched in this slide. So provided you start with a suitably formulated model of a galaxy halo connection, that it's now reasonably straightforward to train a neural network to provide a high accuracy approximation to the model predictions. So this example shows how this can be done to forward model galaxy SED, where here we're using a neural network to approximate predictions of a stellar population synthesis library such as FSPS. And the upshot really is just that this AI acceleration technique provides just the practical capability to start from an n-body simulation and to forward predict galaxy spectra and photometry with essentially the same speed and efficiency as simple models like the stellar to halo mass relation. Now thanks to computational performance and also differentiability that's inherited by deep learning libraries such as JAX and TensorFlow. So on the right here, I'm showing just an example of this application, a forthcoming paper led by Chavez Montero, for predicting galaxy photometry from such a surrogate model. Okay, so next slide. Great, so another area where I think really large strides have been made since the last meeting is the treatment of subhalo disruption and orbital evolution. So in this figure on the left, Fengzhu Zhang has recently developed this StatGen model for the orbital evolution of satellite galaxies, accounting for a wide range of effects, such as artificial numerical disruption, tidal stripping, and baryonic effects like the presence of a disk. And closely related work has gone towards building a compendium of subhalo orbits with a DASH library generated by extremely high resolution simulations of individual subhalo orbits. There's also been some very interesting work done in parallel using machine learning to characterize subhalo disruption and merging of satellites into fire simulations. And I think over the coming years, we're really continuing to see lots of continued progress along these lines. And before I'll pass back to Peter, I'll just briefly comment that I think this is a really exciting area where we'll continue to see a really sort of prime target for these techniques benefiting from this AI acceleration technique to improve the efficiency with which we can make these highly complex, physically realistic predictions. Okay, Peter, I hand back off to you.
Great. So I think something we'll see more of in the future, especially for empirical models, is sort of a blurring of the lines that Sownak drew at the very beginning. So in other words, empirical models taking on more characteristics of galaxies beyond just stellar mass and star formation rate. And here's an example from an upcoming paper by my student, Hao-Yuan Zhang, of putting black holes into galaxies in such a way of matching all the observed, say, properties of quasar luminosity functions, aging and occupation fractions in galaxies, and so on. Go to the next slide. Empirical modeling, I think, will benefit normally from this genius technique that Ben Moster wrote about recently. That is, instead of some human having to decide how to put galaxies into halos and working through all the different ways of parameterizing that, what are the important connections between halos and galaxies, actually you can train a machine to do this very effectively and very simply. And at least in my case, if I'd had this technique, it would have saved years off my life in developing some of my empirical models. So I'm really excited about this new technique of developing empirical models and looking forward to what that will bring. All right, so I think that's the last slide, and we can stop here and ask for questions.
Wonderful. Guys, thank you very much. I propose that the panelists who are around actually unmute themselves if they can, and we shake hands. Actually, this is nice to make it a bit more physically disconnected. Thank you very much, guys. All right, so I invite everybody to raise their hands on Zoom or to ask anything they will be interested in discussing on the Google Doc. So I see some of the, I see Joanne Kuhn. So I try to allow you to talk. Joanne, can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Wonderful, yes, thank you.
Oh, great. Hi, yes, thank you. This is awesome. I had a question for Peter for the plot you showed for putting in spin and all these different things and the different clustering. And I wondered if you controlled for mass, if you were comparing, that plot.
Yeah,
if you like did the same mass selection when you compared different spins, do you use the same mass, mass matching?
Thanks, Joanne. That's a great question. So basically, to make these mocks, I looked in very narrow bins of Vmax and then split halos within each bin by higher or lower quantities like spin. So in other words, this was controlling for how spin changes with Vmax or mass effectively too. And the same thing for the galaxies in the observations. Those were split at fixed mass into high and low size. At fixed stellar mass. Excuse me.
Thanks.
All right. David Weinberg, you should be able to speak up.
Thanks. So great talks. Question for Peter or Andrew. When you talk about the neural network training techniques, I guess my question is about the training set. Is the notion that you're starting with a hydro simulation and you're training the network to predict the simulation galaxy properties or the semi-analytic galaxy properties given the dark matter, or is your training set observations and you're trying to infer this connection by fitting to the observations, or are you aiming to use it both ways?
Great. So I think Ben is around, so he can chime out. He can chime in if I'm getting this wrong. The idea is you start with a dark matter simulation, and so you know properties of dark matter halos. and you train a model to predict the properties of galaxies that would come out. And your loss function is then the observables. In other words, things like the stellar mass function, clustering of galaxies, and so on. And so you try to train such that you get a better match to the observables and keep on iterating with that. So your training set is really the same observed data that people have been using to calibrate empirical models and semitic models and so on.
So I actually have a different answer to that, although I think my understanding of Ben's result, and again, you should chime in if Peter didn't get it right, that's also my understanding. But if you could go up a few more, up a few slides, Sownak, to slide 28. So David, great question. So I think one of the key things we should have in the forefront of our minds in the coming years with the use of machine learning, particularly AI, is uncertainty quantification. And in this case, it's actually quite a different application of AI. Here, it's actually the galaxy halo model that you're interested in itself that is being emulated. So in this case, the galaxy halo model actually includes stellar population synthesis. And so you actually use, when you actually fit to observational data in the same way that we're used to doing, rather than using the actual galaxy model, you use an AI approximation. That would never be possible. Such a galaxy model that includes SPS would never be possible when running a 2-point function MCMC, but if you use an AI accelerated prediction, then it is. And so in this case, you actually get to retain the traditional notion of a Bayesian inference, but you get the benefit of the AI acceleration of the technique.
Ben, please feel free to speak up if you want to add anything.
I'm just nodding. I agree with both of you. I think, yeah, what Peter says is yeah, we can train it both directly on observations to really figure out what kind of empirical relations we need, instead of doing that by hand, as Peter said, which we've been doing for years and years. But the other thing is, yeah, Andrew, we can also use it, to predict SEDs, but also to speed up other things within any prediction. For example, also in hydrodynamical simulation, AI can be very beneficial. For example, there were papers, where the whole cooling routine was done with a neural network. So, different applications can be very useful.
Yeah, just on that point, if I may, I mean, even in the hydrodynamical simulations, where one particularly neat application of these AI techniques is that if you want to understand, for example, the roles of these assembly bias or secondary bias type terms, you can certainly make use of the machine learning techniques to get the sort of information content of different secondary parameters in trying to predict something like what the clustering of galaxies should be. That, of course, so for example, we've applied this to illustrious TNG, and we've found, for example, different levels of contribution coming in when you fold in, for example, the environment of the galaxy in addition to the mass, but also to different extents with the velocity anisotropy is, or the velocity dispersion is, and the sort of different ranking of these secondary parameters is something that you can squeeze out quite nicely with these AI techniques applied to hydro.
David, are you satisfied with the discussion?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add? Otherwise, Andrew Grazzo, you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the question is to Peter and Andrew. I was curious, lots of interesting bits here. Ask many more questions, but the question I was most interested in is Peter, the result that Peter mentioned, that the clustering as a function of size favored Jiang-et-al model. So I was wondering how this is consistent with the previous paper that we did together on size being proportional to the virial radius, also giving a good description of galaxy clustering. So how do you reconcile the two results? So on the one hand, it seemed like size is proportional to the virial radius. At the same time, you were saying that this result was suggesting that coefficient of proportionality dependent on constraint. Or maybe I misunderstood, so I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, great. And so I was going fast, and so I skipped this important detail. Both predictions here assume that the dominant factor setting the galaxy size is the halo radius. And then the question is, what sets the scatter in galaxy size at fixed halo radius? So you definitely know, but then just to remind other people, the classic galaxy size model is basically that the galaxy size is proportional to the halo spin times the halo radius. And so that prediction would be the red line. So galaxy size is correlated with halo radius, but then the scatter at fixed halo radius is 100% correlated with spin. Whereas the bottom plot, or the bottom gray error bars, that would be for a model where that deviation at fixed halo radius is proportional to the halo concentration to some negative power.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Is there